story that must be told. Here's a little story that must be told. Here's a little story. Here's a little story.
My name is Gabriel Teodros. I'm an MC from South Seattle. Seattle hip-hop has been a part of my life before I knew it was hip-hop. My earliest memories of life are literally going outside of my mom's house in Columbia City and seeing people breakdancing on the corner before I knew it was called breakdancing. I thought that was just playing outside, and it was what everybody did. This is in the early 80s, and everyone would walk around with boom boxes like the size of my body. Hip-hop really helped me understand and explain my life and my world. You know, my family, my mother is one of the old-timers from Ethiopia. She's one of the first of her generation to move from Ethiopia to Seattle. So she moved to Seattle in the 70s. And I grew up in a house where nobody looked like me. Everyone spoke Amharic. English is my second language. And I went to school where there weren't any other Ethiopians either. Predominantly black elementary schools, middle schools, high schools. And it was hip-hop that helped me understand what this world was that I was navigating. I'm from the south end of Seattle. That's important to me because the rest of Seattle, outside of the Central District and parts of the West, doesn't represent our experience. That's not a form of set tripping or anything. I just grew up kind of with a chip on my shoulder towards the rest of Seattle that acted like we didn't exist. I'm from a part of Seattle that's predominantly people of color, that's an immigrant experience, there's a lot of people from the third world that came together against all odds, that had to carry home with them, that had to be home, that had to make a home, that survived and thrived and made a place beautiful while the rest of the city kind of shit on them. We survived and we thrived in spite of our city and not because of it. The police repression that people in Seattle hip-hop had to face. In 1984, breakdancing, they made a law where they outlawed breakdancing in Seattle because it's young people of color gathered outside. There must be a problem. I remember growing up, whenever there was a shooting that was just remotely in the area of a hip-hop show, they would blame the hip-hop show. We had rallies for this in the late 90s to save hip-hop music, so we could keep doing shows in these venues that only kind of sort of wanted us anyways. May she rest in peace, Rawa Hapte. She talked about this when she was alive, but when she, first opened Hidmo on 20th and Jackson, which it was a community center cleverly disguised as an Eritrean restaurant in Seattle Central District. When she first opened that restaurant that became this really important place for Seattle hip-hop, the police came and met with her in her restaurant and said, you can do any type of music you want to do, but don't do hip-hop. Hip-hop attracts gangs. These young people of color gathering is not a good thing. We don't want you to do that, They did that to Rahua. It's always been an uphill climb for us coming from Seattle as hip-hop artists and just as musicians of color and just as people of color in this city, There has been an ongoing, fight for our music and our culture in this city that has largely been undocumented. Like I always say, hip-hop saved my life before I ever tried doing anything with it because it gave language to what I was going through, It gave language to oppressive systems that we were living through. It gave language to the violence that we were experiencing, I grew up in the South End and I went to school in the Central District. And these two neighborhoods were at war with each other, And like a lot of people my age in that time, in that place, I didn't think I was going to live to see 18. I didn't think I was going to live to see 21. And that can be a really scary, isolating feeling when you're watching friends die, When you go to middle school and your friends that you go to school with are friends one day, and then the next day they realize that the other person's from another neighborhood and suddenly they're mortal enemies and they're fighting immediately and you're just in the middle of it, like what's happening, Hip-hop absolutely explained what was happening to me. So it made me feel like I wasn't alone. It also inspired me in a lot of ways to take my life into my own hands. You know, hip hop inspired me to read the autobiography of Malcolm X because I wanted to know who Chuck D was talking about, you know. It inspired me to read Mumia Abu-Jamal because people were saying free Mumia in songs, you know, and these writers also helped me save my own life, you know. So some of the early memories are Music Menu, which is a record store on Rainier Avenue that I used to go to. Key from Central Intelligence, I remember I used to see him there. I remember seeing a Silver Shadow D tape sitting there like early on, and that was like one of the first Seattle releases I remember seeing on a shelf, you know. And of course we knew Sir Mix-a-Lot, and there was a rumor about Ishmael Butler from Diggable Planets being from Seattle, but like nobody knew if it was true at the time, you know. It was like the Central District rumor because he was older than us. But in 1996, Tribal Music dropped a record called Do the Math, and there was another compilation that K Records put out called 14 Fathoms Deep. And those two compilations really put me on to the diversity and just the amount of talent that existed here in Seattle. That same year, a guy named Jonathan Moore, a.k.a. Wordsayer from Source of Labor, came to my high school, actually. He came to Garfield, and he was passing around a Source of Labor CD single. So those were probably my first memories of Seattle hip-hop. The Flavor magazine was another really big like introduction to Seattle hip-hop. Flavor was a magazine that was it was distributed nationally, but you could get free copies at the Zell's Chicken across the street from Garfield High School, and I used to pick that up every month, I think it was. When I was 16 years old, so that's 1997, I had newly become aware of Seattle's hip-hop scene. I'm a closet MC, right? I've written a bunch of raps, but I haven't really shared them with more than one person. And it's around the time that Biggie dies, right, in Los Angeles. My family moves to Las Vegas, Nevada. I stayed in Las Vegas until 1999. And in that environment in Vegas, for the first time, I'm at a school in Vegas called Bonanza High School. And it was a predominantly white school where Nazi skinheads were my classmates. And there was a police substation in the middle of the school that routinely targeted the youth of color, what few of us there were, you know? It was such a different environment. And being in that environment actually was, you know, along with hip-hop, was one of the things that really let me know that that feeling of thinking I'm going to die by 18, by 21 was something that was done to me, you know, and realizing that it was a system in place that wanted me to want to die and wanted kids like me to want to die made me want to live more than anything else. So it was actually in Vegas was when I really started rapping in front of people. I started taking my own music seriously for the first time. And I started taking my education seriously because I knew if I left it to the system, they were going to eat me up and spit me out and leave me to die. Mumia Abu-Jamal and also I would say the autobiography of Malcolm X, like those two writers, I saw myself in their stories, you know. For Malcolm, like I felt like the time in Vegas was like my time in prison in a way, you know, because he went to prison and that's where he found Islam. He changed his life. He came out, you know, became this great leader that we all know and love. And Mumia was writing these books that were saving my life from death row, literally. And Mumia was just this really profound, deep, loving voice. Yeah, they meant a lot to me. I went to 6 different high schools while I was in Vegas. The first one I went to, Bonanza, I had gone back to that school because I had a crush. I go to our history class, 4th period, that we were sharing, and she's not there. And I asked my friend, like, yo, where's Diana? And one of Diana's friends said, she's not here right now. Come back after lunch. She'll probably be back. So I'm like, all right, cool. I walk across the street. I walk through this desert to a community college library that I used to go to all the time when I went to that school. And I didn't know it. I had some headphones on, but there was a police officer on a bicycle following me through the desert. And halfway through the desert, he pulls out his gun, cocks it, and says, you know, put your hands up where I can see him. Stop where you are. And he's far enough away from the school and different things where it's like, if he shot me, nobody would know what happened. So I stop after a minute, you know, because I didn't hear him the first time. The second time I heard him, I take my headphones off, and I'm like, excuse me, did I do something wrong? And he like, you know, cocks the gun like he's about to fire. So I'm like, okay, all right, whatever, you know, like, what do you need? And he has me lay face down in the dirt, in the desert, and handcuffs me. And once I'm face down in the desert with my hands tied behind my back in these handcuffs, he tells me to stand up. And it was the most powerless feeling I've ever had. He picked me up when I couldn't stand up, pulled me over to where he had called backup, so there's more police, and they're scouring the whole parking lot looking for any drugs or guns that I must have dropped, and they can't find anything. And finally they put me in the police substation in the high school, and I have to wait for my mom to come get me. And I remember feeling like, yeah, this is it. This is the school to prison pipeline, like in effect, right here, right now. There's a song from Gangstar that came out that year from an album called Moment of Truth. The song is called JFK to LAX. And I always, always, always remember that moment where I was sitting in this substation where Guru says, as I sit feeling the pain in my wrists, I vow to myself that I must change this shit because my wrists were hurting all day from the handcuffs. And I remember sitting there thinking, I got to change this, All of those experiences combined are why I've always had such a political, aspect to my music because, the personal is political, and all of the things that we go through, they're not isolated incidents. These are all parts of a bigger system that has affected all of our generations, plural, of youth of color in this society. And I think that's what hip-hop does the best, is provide a platform and amplify those stories and humanize us, The first thing I was a part of when I came back to Seattle was a hip-hop collective called 500 Years. We called ourselves an artistic rebuttal to the last 5 centuries of colonization and oppression, and we said that at every single show. I was 18 years old, maybe the youngest person in that group. We were a live band with 6 MCs, and mind you, this is 1999, Seattle, Washington. There's not any all-ages shows, really. It was really just poetry, open mics, and rallies, and protests, and marches. And as a politically, focused kind of hip-hop band, we ended up doing every single rally you could imagine, from Mumia 911 to the WTO protests. We were right there in the middle of it. The opening of the first independent media center in the world, we were performing at it, I didn't go to college, but that was my college. I got a political education. I feel like that work and that ethic of, community work, envisioning the future that we want to see and bringing it to life, raising the next generation, providing platforms for younger artists, teaching, working in schools, working in prisons even. It's all been married with the way I approach hip-hop music from that moment on. I can't separate these things. It's all one thing to me, And I met Khazm that year. Yeah, I met him in 1999, yeah. So when I released Lovework and when we released Abyssinian Creole, when we started Zulu Radio, all those things happened while I was roommates with Danny. And the house was like a hip-hop hostel, and there was always someone on the couch. Yeah. Always. Yeah. Getting to a studio was very inaccessible for us. All I wanted to do was get our band to a studio to cut a 12-inch single. Because this is the era where, this is the tail end of the raucous era of Hieroglyphics and Project Blowed and all these independent kind of movements from different parts of the country putting out 12-inch singles, and I just wanted to get my band to record 2 songs that we could cut to wax and get on one of these indie labels, and to me that was the goal. We never even got to a studio as a band. It wasn't until probably maybe 2000, 2001 that I really started recording a lot of material. And actually it was Khazm was one of the first people I knew that had a home studio. And the second and third persons was Macklemore and a guy from Macklemore's original crew, Zachary Self. I would go between Ben, which is Macklemore, Zach, and Khazm's house. And between those 3 studios and then some studios in Vancouver, BC, that was how I did my first album when I was 20, back in 2000, 2001, yeah. And I would say Jonathan Moore and Erica White, Wordsayer and Kylia, the Wonder Twins at that time, they really made some things accessible to us, like the Sit and Spin. And they had an all-ages hip-hop night on Sundays, and I went to that religiously, you know. And also, I remember John had us play, like, Festival Sundiata at Seattle Center and had us do little festivals at Seattle Center, but that was it, you know. And to be honest, I don't remember ever seeing a paycheck for any of those shows, ever. And I didn't complain because we were young and hungry and just hadn't even thought about the industry yet. Shows were $5 or they were free, and we were primarily performing for other artists. Like, Seattle hip-hop did not have fans, and at least the music we did, like, did not have fans until 2005. So up until that point, we were performing for our friends, you know, for other artists. Like, the shows were sorely underattended. Everything was about in person when I first started. I would say in 2000, 2001 is when I started doing more home recordings, and all those initial home recordings went directly to cassette, and we would sell tapes, and we would go to Westlake Center or to wherever the shows were, and we would ask strangers if they listened to hip-hop and try to sell little $5 tapes. And when we got access to CD burners, then we started doing it with CDs, you know. My first tapes and CDs were all home manufactured. They involved a lot of runs to Kinko's and a lot of time spent, like, hitting high-speed dub or burn on the CD. And I would write on a lot of these CDs, and it was just a real independent kind of thing, you know, for a while. We started going to Vancouver, BC also, like, around 2000, 2001. And my time in Vancouver, especially back then, was hugely, like, important, you know, because I still don't have access to most venues in Seattle. But 19 is the legal drinking age in Vancouver. And at that time, Vancouver had a weekly hip-hop night called Context that people from Battle Axe Records helped throw. They had Battle Axe Records, which was a really big independent hip-hop label at the time. And there was just a lot of activity up there. So we started going to Vancouver, and actually a lot of my first recordings happened there. A lot of my first tour happened in Canada through people I met in Vancouver. And the little tapes and stuff that I said I was distributing hand-to-hand here in Seattle, those got to Vancouver before I did. So when I got to Vancouver, people knew who I was, like, on the underground scene, you know, which was wild to me. Like, I was meeting strangers that knew my lyrics. We got a lot of love in Vancouver as a crew before we got it in Seattle. So I released the first record, Son to a Recycled Soul, 2001, CDR styles, the hand-to-hand sales, dusty tape, wouldn't want to play for anyone now. On that album, though, is my first collaboration with a guy named Khalil Crisis, who's better known as Kings. And me and Khalil Kings, we formed our group pretty much the next year, 2002. That group is called Abyssinian Creole, and we're still active today. So that's the longest collaboration that I've had in my life. Khalil moved to New York in 2002. I followed him later that year, and we basically laid the groundwork for what became Abyssinian Creole in New York. Yeah, even the name of the group, Abyssinian Creole, like, Khalil came up with it while we were riding the subway in New York, you know. My family's from Ethiopia, as I was talking about. Khalil's got family from Haiti and the Dominican Republic, so it's kind of a merging of our identities, you know. Abyssinia for Ethiopia, Creole for the language they speak in Haiti, the oldest African nation with the newest African tongue, you know. Biggest moments in my career, the most important ones for me was 2005, releasing the Abyssinian Creole album was very important, and we launched Zulu Radio the same month. Also, that time period, Blue Scholars released their second record. Macklemore released The Language of My World, which is the first album that people remember him by. Cancer Rising had music out. Grayskull had music out. Chocolate was about to release her solo album. And it was a moment where I felt like Seattle hip-hop made a turn, where we started having fans that came to shows that knew our lyrics that we didn't know. I feel like it was a moment that changed Seattle hip-hop, and in a small way the world, forever. And it happened because we were friends and fans of each other. Yeah, 2005 to 2007, I would say, was like, it was a golden era for Seattle hip-hop, you know. Sport and Life Records was really doing their thing. D-Black, Spaceman, Fatal, Dime Def was out doing their thing. There was just so many of us, 2007, I released an album called Lovework, which is an album that I'm still the most proud of. One of them. That album was inspired by bell hooks. It was all about, redefining love in ways that are critical, real, that, with the understanding that to really know love, we've got to undo systems of domination that stop people from really being loving. And that album took me around the world. That's the one that like people really remember me for. I'm very proud of that work and very thankful for everything it did for my life. Those moments are really special, really important to me. I definitely started incorporating more traditional Ethiopian music in my work, probably around 2008. And I've done a couple records now that were like primarily in that, I don't even want to call it genre, but more inspired by traditional Ethiopian music than like, say, jazz or soul, which is where a lot of the other beats kind of draw from. 2012, got to do a record called Copper Wire, which brought me to Ethiopia for the first time, and that was major. Like, I got to tour in Ethiopia. I got to tour in Cuba. I got to tour in Mexico twice now. Like, yeah, it's really special, and I got to do it with no major record deal ever, super underground. It's fly, like I've lived out a lot of my dreams and more, and I'm 42 and I still feel like I'm just at the beginning, So from project to project, I work with different producers. Almost every album I've done has had a different producer, except for Lovework and Heir to a Bird were the same producer. Those were both with Amos Miller. And then there's a few records where like Color People's Time Machine, where I worked with like 10 different producers. And my latest album is actually, there's a few different producers, but I produced the bulk of it. And that's the first time I've ever done that, All these years later, 2023, I finally learned how to make beats. It's wild. I'm not somebody that's like chasing fame or any of that. In fact, there was a long time period where I worked against my own, visibility, because I didn't like feeling like I was a part of a system that was taking hip-hop away from its people. And I really felt like that when we started doing shows with primarily white audiences. That was a really, really hard time for me, And I purposely stopped doing certain shows and focused my energy on community work. Hip-hop is sacred to me. Like, this is my medicine. Hip-hop is the thing that saved my life. And if I ever come to this music in a way that's bitter, it's going to be bad medicine that I'm sharing with people. It's going to turn poisonous. The same ingredients that make any medicine can make a poison, So, yeah, as long as I stay true, I'm doing all right, It's funny because a lot of people my age and older really, they get stuck in hip-hop. And back in the days was when it was the realest and it was the best. I am not that person. Like, to me, we are living through a golden age right now. There's more women that are killing it across the globe than at any time. Like No Name, Ivy Soul, Open Mike Eagle, Quelle Chris, Jean Grey forever, one of my all-time top fives. Brother Ali, who I just was on his podcast this week. Yeah, there's so many. I'll literally be here for the next 3 years if you want me to list more artists. So for me growing up, radio was one of the ways that we learned about new music, right? I'm from an era before the internet. Like, the internet wasn't, it was around actually, but there was just a few websites in the 90s, The social media was definitely not around yet, So the radio and magazines were the two ways you would find out about new music, So I was a kid that used to listen to the hip-hop shows every single week. I used to sit by my box and tape the radio shows. And that's how I learned about a lot of new artists. So radio has always had this really special place in my heart. As a DJ, I don't know. Like, DJing on the radio is just something that's so fun. I started with Khazm and WD-40, actually, back in 2005 with Zulu Radio. The three of us launched that show together. That was on KBCS 91.3. I think Zulu Radio is still on the same station with different hosts. We all three of us co-hosted that show. I did from 05 to 08. And then I took a break from radio because my own music had taken off. And then I got back into it in 2018, I think, 2017 or 18 at KXP. It's another form of storytelling for me. It's not about my voice being on a microphone. It's about serving a story and serving a community. And you can do it with a playlist. I mean, I always look for what's not being told. I always look for what's not being heard. I look for those stories because I identify with the people that have been left out. I identify with the people that have been forgotten. I identify with the people not included. I identify with the people that are underinvited. Because I'm from the South End, because I was born into a body that's different. I really think that we all need each other to survive, and we need to hear each other's stories to get a fuller picture of humanity. Like, we're not going to get through this time in our lives with all these conflicts, pandemics, wars, different places, a genocide happening in Palestine right now, a genocide happening in the Congo and Sudan, patriarchy run rampant, white supremacy on the rise. Like, it's just a battlefield. You know what I mean? Like, that's... Yeah, people will sell you a story about a people before they fire a bullet, before they drop a bomb, you know? And the people who are being attacked, it's like they have to tell their stories for their own survival. And I don't know, I just have a heart. I'm human, so I care. Yeah, hip-hop is absolutely telling those stories because there's artists in every single region telling their stories. And to be honest, speaking about Palestine, I learned about Palestine because of hip-hop artists that told their stories from Palestine. So absolutely, like, hip-hop is telling these stories everywhere. You just got to look for it, you know? And all of this is about, for me, is about being the best version of myself, you know? Like, yeah. I always want to give hip-hop back the feeling that it gave me, you know? Hip-hop saved my life. I want other people to, like, to feel that love, to feel that intensity, to feel that intention when they listen to my music. I want to stand in my full truth every time I'm behind a microphone. I never want to do a song that I regret. I never want to do a song that I have to feel sorry for. I always want it to be my full, complete truth in that moment. If I do that, I did it. You know what I mean?